was raised in a barn. And I can leave the door open. You, however, cannot. I grew up very remote, no television, no radio, but still there was plenty of messaging from pop culture about what I should look like and how I should feel. I didn't feel like that. When I would look at magazines, I wasn't that girl on the cover. I felt like there was a huge gap between who I was and what I was supposed to look like and feel like. My mom left when I was 8. My dad took over raising me and my 2 brothers. And my dad had a lot of trauma. He knew he was in trouble when he went to Vietnam, and it was more relaxing than his home life. And so he came back from Vietnam, and when my mother left, he began to really trauma triggers. He began to raise me and my 2 brothers as a single father. All of us, if we're raised with what I call an emotional language, grow up speaking that emotional language, whether we like it or not, because you can't exist in a vacuum. And so you can only abstain from behavior so long unless it's replaced with new behavior, you're going to go to your old patterning. My dad didn't have many skill sets beyond what he was raised with, and he tried to use his will to abstain from the patterning that he was given as a child, the emotional habits, as much as he swore he wouldn't repeat them. When push came to shove, he did. And I left at a young age, at 15. I'd learned a fair amount by that age. I grew up bar singing. I was probably the only 4th grader that went from elementary school right to the bar. We would do 4-hour sets, and I had a front row seat to people in pain. The great thing about alcohol is it makes people less reserved, and so they'll live a life quite out loud, what they might normally hide. The alcohol makes no barrier, and I was able to see the pain they were in very clearly. And I began to see different tactics people would use, whether it was relationships, rage, drugs, alcohol. And I sang in bars long enough that I got to watch the long-term net effect. And I learned that you never can outrun pain. It never worked. And I learned about buffaloes, which sounds funny. Buffaloes are the only animal that move right into the middle of a storm. When a storm's coming, they head to it, because it's the quickest way through the storm. So I decided to be a buffalo. When I was in pain, I would move closer toward it as quickly as I could. I would get curious and I would get observant. And I wrote it down. I didn't know that was the one skill in my life that would end up saving me again and again and again. It's interesting, we all have pain. Nobody gets out of life without it. And yet we have some level of expectation that we're doing something wrong if we encounter pain. We're not doing anything wrong. I didn't know that for quite a long time, though. When I moved out at 15, I knew I should be a statistic. I knew that statistically, kids like me end up repeating the cycle that they're raised by. I didn't want to be a statistic. I knew happiness wasn't taught in my household, and I wanted to see if it was a teachable or learnable skill. And I had a teacher that had me reading philosophy at a young age, and I decided if I could take notes and use the dialectic and maybe be very clever, I could figure my way and use my brain to get myself out of being a statistic. I became very hypervigilant. I was looking for all the problems in the future that might be happening. I began to look for future traps. Anybody that's raised with trauma or abuse, we get very good at this. We get good at reading the weather, reading the signs, feeling for what's around us. The problem with that is it didn't actually keep me safe. Don't get me wrong, I knew not to drink, I knew not to do drugs, I knew to surround myself in people that had better habits than I did. It got me pretty far, arguably could be my intuition. It also took me out of my heart, though, and out of my intuition in a lot of ways. Hypervigilance is the opposite of mindfulness, and I was incredibly hypervigilant. I was always looking for what is the next trap, where am I going to be safe? Because I was vulnerable. I was 15 and I was hitchhiking to work to pay rent. I was working 2 jobs. I couldn't always make it home and would sometimes be sleeping on someone's couch for several days because I couldn't hitchhike far enough out into the woods where the cabin was where I was paying rent. Fast forward just a couple years. I ended up in San Diego where my mother was. She had heart problems. I went to take care of her. And I was working several jobs, barely getting by. And I had this boss proposition me, and when I wouldn't sleep with him, he wouldn't give me my paycheck. And so I got kicked out of where I was living. My mother got kicked out where she was living. She went back to Alaska. I didn't think it was going to be that bad. I thought that I would live in a car in San Diego, which when you're raised in a saddle barn with your brothers and your dad and with an outhouse, being by yourself in a car in San Diego really isn't that bad, comparatively. I didn't think it would last that long. It lasted longer than I anticipated. I had sick kidneys. I was having panic attacks. I was agoraphobic, which is an intense fear of leaving your home, which when you don't have a home is really exasperated, turns out. I had this little corner with a flowering bush, and that was the closest thing to nature, and it made me feel safe. And I had a terror that if I left that corner, I would be stricken with illness. I had sick kidneys at the time, no medical care, couldn't afford anything. And this hypervigilance took on its own, it became a monster that ruled my life. My anxiety and my fear and my panic attacks brought my life to an absolute grinding halt. And I did things to try and give myself a sense of empowerment. And one of those things was stealing. It was food. It started with carrots, which apparently are the gateway vegetable. Because pretty soon it led to the hard stuff, you know, like organic apples, medjool dates. It was always food. I was a very healthy homeless kid because I was beginning to look at food as medicine to see if I could heal my kidneys and help with my health. But then one day it looked like it would escalate. There was a storefront window and there was a dress in it, and I coveted it. It was girly and clean and new and just everything I felt like I wasn't. And so in a really false sense of taking care of myself, I went in there and I decided to see how I could steal it. And I was in the dressing room, and there was this mirror in front of me, and I caught my reflection in the mirror, and I couldn't escape what I looked like. I looked like a statistic. I looked like a homeless kid that was stealing, and I was going to end up in jail or dead in short order if I didn't turn things around. And it was in that moment that I remembered a quote that I had read by Buddha that said, happiness doesn't depend on who you are or what you have. It depends on what you think. And I was in this incredible position of being stripped of every single thing but my thoughts. And so I decided to see if I could turn my life around literally one thought at a time. To do that, you have to figure out what you're thinking. And if you've ever suffered from intense anxiety, it's very difficult to perceive your thoughts in real time. So I tried to see if I could figure out a hack. And our thoughts get cooled down into action. And so if you want to see what you're thinking, watch what your hands are doing. It'll tell you a lot about what you actually think about yourself and what you're capable of. And so I started writing down what my hands were doing. I had a little notebook and I would follow my hands around. And I would see how many times they opened doors and how many times I ate, how many times I'd shake hands or didn't want to shake hands. I literally just wrote everything that my hands did down because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And I began to look back at this journal, my little data points, and I realized I quit believing in myself, which is wild. I was raised on a homestead. I worked very hard. I had a lot of capabilities. I had jobs my entire life, and here I was 3 short years later, completely believing I couldn't even earn $40 to earn a dress. But a really interesting side effect happened, and it wasn't one I was prepared or anticipated. As I was watching my hands and taking notes, my anxiety was quiet. It was remarkable. It was like the best side effect ever of a trial study. My anxiety quieted down every time I was observant and curious, and every time I walked in real time and watched my hands. But the second I wasn't doing that, my anxiety overtook me. I learned so much in that year. That was one of the most valuable years of my life. I not only learned that each of us have pain, I learned that we can convert pain. And it's each of our jobs to transmute pain into something more beautiful, into something useful. We're all going to have pain. And we all have the opportunity to transmute and transform that pain into something beautiful and something useful, and we get to decide what that is. I started to write because it made me feel calm. It made me feel more relaxed. It helped me almost feel like an alchemist as I wrote. I felt like I was able to transform that pain in real time. I learned about fear, that fear is a thief, and it robs us of the only opportunity we have to change, which is right now. I can't change in the future and I can't change in the past. The only thing I can change is in this little magical window right here. But what anxiety and fear does is it doesn't let you show up right here. So I learned that for me, the word mindfulness wasn't around, or at least I didn't know of it. But I learned that if I could observe a thought and then create a gap before I acted on that thought, and the bigger I could make that gap, I could now bring in new tools, new education. And so I would learn with time, and it took practice. It takes practice. And I would pick one thing, the urge to steal. I started to notice triggers. When I felt particularly powerless or helpless, I wanted to steal. And I got a biochemical reward. I felt like I was in control. It's called a habit loop, I found out. I couldn't change being homeless or feeling powerless, but I could change this part, the middle part of the habit loop. Instead of stealing, I turned to writing, and I forced myself neurologically to build a new habit loop, and thus, now that I've studied neuroscience, you actually build a new neural pathway, and you get a different biochemical reward. You get a different payoff. And so I began thinking, if my brain is addictive, naturally, which, by the way, all of our brains are. We have binary computers, and we move toward pleasure, and we move away from pain. And we lay down memories to help us remember where those things are. Well, I learned that stealing was pleasure. It was helpful. I had to rewire that message. And so I had to reteach myself. I wanted something that was more productive. I wanted to get addicted to something that was going to help me have a better outcome in my life. So I turned to writing when I felt particularly helpless. And it's a difficult thing to rewire your brain, but it really only takes a couple of weeks to really start establishing a new neural pathway and starving the old one. So I began one at a time, looking at pain, looking at habits, looking at what things triggered me, taking notes, getting very observant and very, very curious. The more in pain I was, the more curious I got and the calmer I felt. And I began seeing all kinds of patterns. I began learning all kinds of things about myself and taking notes. And I realized there's only two states of being. There's contracted and there's expanded or dilated. And every single thought and every single feeling can be boiled down to one of those two states. And I had to make it that simple for myself, for me to navigate my day. Do I feel like this, or do I feel like this? If I feel like this, what can I do to make myself feel like this? And that was the challenge I had to give myself. Whenever anxiety started to take over, before it totally overtook me, I started to notice it happening. I started to begin to create what now are called hacks. I don't think I knew that word at the time. I learned I couldn't be anxious and grateful at the same time. It's because they're contradictory states, and you can't be in two states simultaneously. So whenever I was anxious, I noticed in my body I felt like this, and I started to think of something I was grateful for. I want to make sure everybody understands it doesn't matter what you have. I was homeless, and I would look at the sunlight coming through this beautiful eucalyptus tree, and it was beautiful, and I was so grateful for it. And I would feel the sun on my skin, and I felt genuine gratitude float over my entire being. I was alive, and I was there, and I was seeing that. And my anxiety lessened as I learned to focus on what I was grateful for. Our brains, arguably, can be a bit hardwired to look for the negative. They think it might be a coping mechanism to survive. And so we really do have to train our brains to see what is positive and what is working. Again, coming back to hypervigilance, it's constantly training you to go, what's a problem, what's a problem, what's a problem? I have to anticipate a future problem. Instead of being right here, right now, saying, what am I capable of doing right now in this moment and in this moment? This moment, creating that gap between noticing my thought. It's amazing what our thoughts do. I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm incapable, I'm not good enough. I just started writing down all the lies that my brain was telling me. And I came up with something I called the antidote thought. Now this is different than affirmative thinking. I don't know if this is okay. This is just my opinion. I don't know what the science says. I never felt affirmative thinking worked for me. It felt like I was lying. If I looked in the mirror and said, I'm beautiful, when I really didn't feel beautiful, it just kind of felt like I was lying to myself, and I hoped it would maybe take hold, maybe I'd start feeling beautiful. I actually learned that an antidote thought is very different because I had a different body reaction. So I'll try and give you a real example. Years later, my career was doing well, and I did a movie, and I had never acted before. And I suddenly started having panic attacks again. They hadn't had them in quite a while. And I had to write down, what is the negative messaging? What am I getting told over and over? And I realized that the thought that kept coming to me, the lie that kept coming to me is, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. And I didn't know what I was doing. In a lot of my life, I didn't know what I was doing. I was too young, taking on too much, and I didn't know what I was doing. So the opposite of that is a good place to start for your antidote thought. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, look in yourself in the mirror and say, I know what I'm doing. It's not true. My body didn't relax. So I'd start searching around. The truth for me was that I'm capable of learning, and I don't quit. When I said that, my entire body relaxed. And so I went from a completely dysfunctional state where I barely could get myself up and out of the door to set on time, to every time I felt that lie come to me in my head, my antidote thought was, I'm capable of learning what to do, and I won't quit. That was the truth. My whole body relaxed. That to me is an antidote thought. And I began to develop these skills, and that's why I built the website, jewelneverbroken.com, where I share these tools that are very simple, But they really work, and Dr. Judson Brewer was kind enough to show actually how they do rewire your brain, which is kind of an amazing thing for a kid who was homeless and just literally coming up with these things to get myself in an expansive state so I could function, and to see why they help and why they work. When I was homeless, I was very lonely, and I realized I deserved to be lonely because nobody knew me. I didn't let anybody know me. I had a lot of armor. The only place I told the truth was in a journal. At least I had that. So I decided to take a very big risk. I was drowning in my armor. Did you know that we're mostly carbon-based? I'm sure most of you know that. It's an 8-sided molecule. And it's actually one of the only molecules that is built to connect with any more molecule than any other. We, at our core, are built to connect. We need connection. And yet, we create these coping mechanisms to keep us safe, and they do, and I honor all the coping mechanisms I developed because I picked the pain that I could handle. But at a certain point, that armor kept me from connecting and having a genuine, authentic ability to connect not only to myself, but to other humans. And I was drowning and I was lonely. And so I took a risk, and I started writing the truth about me. And I started singing in a coffee shop for, it was 2 people came in the first night. And I sang a 5-hour show, because that's what I grew up doing. I didn't know that you could actually just do an hour show and be okay. And I just laid it all out, and these 2 surfers were like, I had no idea anybody else felt that way. And I was like, I didn't know anybody else felt this way. And it was the first time I didn't feel lonely, and I felt seen. I didn't lie about who I was. I wasn't any better. I wasn't any worse. It was just honest, and it felt so good. And I learned our safety is actually in our vulnerability. There's nothing scary about connection. There's nothing scary when you use your intuition to let you know when you're safe or not. It's not all the coping mechanisms that actually keep us safe. It's our heart and it's our gut. So I wrote this song about my hands, about following them around, about realizing that these are mine. I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim. Even if I'm homeless, nobody can make me steal. I was choosing to do that. I wanted to be so angry in the world and say, everybody owes me. Somebody owes me. My parents owed me. Somebody owes me. When I finally realized I owe me, I owe myself a lot. Nobody's coming for me. I'm coming for me. It changed my entire outlook on life, and it put me in the driver's seat. I'll talk more about the driver's seat in a moment. I'll talk about it now. I'm a very visual person, and so I remember reading Descartes, and he said, I think, therefore I am. And as I started learning about what is termed mindfulness now, as I began to shut my eyes and look inside the universe within my own skin and ask myself questions, I got answers. It was really wild. And I saw myself as a car, a vehicle. Your brain is not the driver. It's a steering wheel, but it's not the driver. And so if I could ever so humbly rephrase Descartes' famous saying, blasphemy, it's I perceive what I think, therefore I am. If you can perceive you're sad, you're something other than sad. You're the observer of sad. If you can perceive you're happy, you're something other than happy. You're the observer of it. We're the observers of ourselves, and we can curate our thoughts. We can curate our feelings. We can choose which ones we're going to interact with and which ones we won't. We can tell our brain, thank you, but I'm not going to believe that one. Give me another one. And I learned to curate my thoughts, discipline my thoughts, and to know that that was the start of everything. Every action comes from this. Everything that comes out of my mouth, and our lives get built on these beliefs, whether they're invisible to us or whether we're mindfully aware of them. So my hands meant so much to me, and that's why I wrote this song. Because for me, getting in the driver's seat, getting behind the steering wheel of my brain, learning that I controlled that tool worked for me. My brain works for me. I don't work for my brain. I could rewire myself, and I now have the ability to get behind that wheel and say, I'm going to take this car where I want it to go. I don't have to repeat the cycles of abuse. I don't have to repeat the patterning I was raised with. I can rewire my brain. A lot of my life, and I don't know if any of you relate to this, I felt like I was just tied up in the passenger seat, and there was nobody in the driver's seat. It was just on autopilot, and it was going all over the road and careening into walls, and I was getting in all kinds of trouble. When I started realizing I'm the observer of my thought, it put me in the driver's seat of my very own life. And I had no idea the adventures it would be taking me on. But this is one of the first songs I wrote about what my hands were capable of, that we owe ourselves a lot. And that in many capacities we are. It's funny, I remember homeless kids at the time talking about, God created illnesses and hunger, and I thought, gosh, I think we created hunger. I think we've created climate problems, and I think we can fix them. And so I put my little hand in the air to say, I want to help. I'm going to help my life. I'm going to live my life from the inside out. And this ended up being on the radio. It was really wild. I didn't think it would ever happen at the time. If I could tell the world just one thing, it would be they're all okay. But not to worry, 'cause worry is wasteful and it's useless in times like these. And I will not be made useless. I will not be made idle with despair, or gather myself around my faith, for light does the darkness most fear. My hands are small, I know, but they're not yours, they are my own. But they're not yours, they are my own, and we are never broken. Stole your golden shoes, but it did not steal your laughter, and heartache came to visit me, but I knew it was not ever after.